You know, some people equate Kat Dennings' Darcy Lewis to being the Jar Jar Binks of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And to those people out there, I would ask you this. Would you rather see 2 hours of Darcy Lewis doing stand-up comedy? Or this? Either opinion is valid, but if you can look at me with a straight face and 100% honesty, and you can tell me that you'd rather see that Gungan in a solo film for 2 hours, then you deserve a medal. Oh right, Thor the Dark World. The usual spoilers ahead for Thor the Dark World and the MCU, you know the drill by now. So, Phase 2 of the MCU didn't really get off to the smoothest start. I mean, after the success of the Avengers, everyone was expecting these enormous, expertly crafted superhero films that were just masterclasses in the genre. Instead we got, well, Trevor Slattery as a fake Mandarin who is literally a clueless drunk actor, and Malekith who is... Actually, that is a good question. Who is Malekith? If you wanted the textbook definition of a generic superhero movie villain, if there were a dictionary that has these sorts of definitions and pictures alongside, in that particular entry you would see an enormous picture of, guess who? Malekith. Because guys, Malekith is one of the blandest villains to ever be put on the big screen. I mean, while I think Mickey Rourke's Whiplash was laughably bad and cringeworthy in most scenes, at least Jon Favreau made an effort to give his character some amount of motivation. And at least on paper they tried to give the villain some convincing arcs. Even with Abomination, there was a tiny bit of something there where maybe Blonsky was just mad or something, and then Hulk breaks every single bone in his body and now he's super mad. So there's something, at least. So then, what's Malekith's backstory? He hates things. And also wants the ether. And that really isn't much of an exaggeration. It's established at the beginning of the film that he and the Dark Elves were going to use the ether to destroy the universe, but Bor, Thor's grandfather, stopped him and buried the ether. Which, in itself, was a terrible decision, but we'll get there later. Anyways, Malekith is now awake again because the ether is awake again as well, and then he tries to get the ether and destroy the universe by using the ether to ether something, ether something. I mean, really, how much more generic can you actually get? I do have to be fair though, in the science fiction fantasy genre, this trope for a villain can work, and it can work very, very well. I mean, look at Sauron in Lord of the Rings. Does he really have any motivation? Not really, other than he's evil. But why does that work so much better than Malekith? Well, I think it's because he's intimidating and he's powerful, two things that Malekith really isn't. Malekith spends half the movie just going around and talking in a very scary voice with some prosthetic elf makeup and costumes, and he really does absolutely nothing to showcase his powers. That's why I really don't care about Malekith. Again, in fantasy-type films, the villains don't necessarily need that much motivation, and we'll see later in Thor Ragnarok how that can work a little better, but you still need to give us something. Anything for the audience to grasp onto and go, okay, but Malekith is cool because X, Y, and Z. But he's not. He's not cool. There's nothing remarkable about him at all. He's literally the very definition of a throwaway villain. I guess his costume is kind of cool, except it's also kind of terrible looking in some other scenes. The CGI and visuals for him are just very, very inconsistent. This film is directed by Alan Taylor, and from all accounts, it looks like he didn't have a great time with this movie as he and Marvel butted heads. Whatever the case may be, I found that he really didn't contribute anything unique as a director. Is that his fault? Well, no, not really, because he'd gone from mostly television work to one of the biggest movies of that entire year. Then again, the show that he came from was Game of Thrones, so you'd feel like he should have known at least something. Regardless of the situation, he as a director really didn't add anything unique to this film either, which only adds to the notion that this film is really generic in every sense of the word. There's really nothing that stands out about this movie except for a couple little things, and while there isn't anything atrociously bad either, there isn't anything outstandingly good. However, while these next two films that I'm about to compare are both pretty average in my eyes, I would say that there's a key difference between The Incredible Hulk and Thor the Dark World. Hulk was either laughably bad or completely boring in my opinion, and feels like there were just slips and errors in the filmmaking process, like in the script or the direction. But for Thor the Dark World, it's very, very consistent throughout, for better or for worse. Whether on Earth or on Asgard, it maintains this sort of meandering, plotting pace that makes everything sort of meld together into one, which is, again, pretty fine. The film opens with another piece of narration from Odin as he details the backstory of the Dark Elves and the Ether. Right away, this was a sound improvement over the first Thor film. That film's mistake was having the movie start on Earth and then move to Asgard, which completely confused the tone. The Dark World, at the very least, stuck with the fantasy aspect more, and I think it did that to its benefit. However, we quickly learned that the ether was buried away so that no one would ever find it again, and thus begins one of my biggest complaints about this film, which is plot convenience. Any given movie will have plot conveniences. You're rarely going to find a film that is completely airtight and has an airtight script and story. It's just not going to happen. Again, I point you to Scott Lang getting out of the van because of the rat that saved the universe in Endgame. But plot conveniences will begin to add up very quickly if they're used too much and if they're used at plot points that are too critical to the story. And this is where the Dark World really falters. Or, the king of Asgard at the time of the vanquishing of the Dark Elves decides to bury the ether underground. Why? Who knows, honestly. This is itself not a plot convenience, this is just an incredibly dumb decision made by the character. However, what is a complete plot convenience is the ether happens to get to Jane Foster of all people. This ancient weapon from the Nine Realms, where Thor and Odin preside over, happens to go to Thor's girlfriend. The odds of this happening are astronomically low. How in the world does that happen? The film writes it off quickly as something like fate or whatever, but a movie can only pull that card so many times. You can only stumble into situations so much because of quote-unquote fate. Anyways, then we propel the plot forward, and wouldn't you know it, the Dark Elves manage to completely bombard Asgard because Heimdall, yes, Heimdall, the all-seeing, all-knowing protector of Asgard, can't see their mothership until it's right in front of his face. How does that make any sense? Again, the movie tries to write it off later by saying that even Heimdall can't see them, but why? The movie has to do better than that. And then, when we have the final battle in London, well, first of all, Erik Selvig happens to be in London at the same time as Jane and Darcy, and he happens to be developing these scientific pole things that happen to save the universe because they vanquished Malekith or something at the end. Yeah, before I saw this movie, I didn't remember the science poles either, but there they were. So, much of this movie relies on happenstance, and then it just becomes annoying and a little infuriating at the end. As an audience, you're meant to try to buy into these things because, well, it's a Thor movie. But, especially now, superhero films are held to a much higher standard than just jokey popcorn action movies, and it makes this plot feel really lazy. But on the flip side, because again, I maintain this film is incredibly average, there have to be some positives to outweigh the negatives, so let's talk about Loki. Now, apparently after the success of the Avengers, they went back to do reshoots to add more Loki. And thank goodness they did, because Loki is again easily the best part of this movie. I still love the opening scene where he walks into the throne room in chains and he swaggers up to the throne with confidence that we didn't see him have in the first Thor. And then later we get to see even more sides of him as a trickster as he's always trying to be one step ahead of everyone else. And to his credit, Chris Hemsworth's performance as Thor felt a lot better than it did in the first movie. It's clear now that he's learned a lot since his adventures on Earth, and he feels more mature, more confident. There are even little hints of his future Ragnarok Infinity War Thor in some scenes, like where he faces the Cronin and says, "Hello, I accept your surrender." So right away, this film has a huge advantage over its predecessor because Loki and Thor individually are so much better and more charismatic, as well as a team. We all at least remember this movie for the one scene where Loki turns into Captain America while he's walking with Thor. That's just a brilliant scene. And there are other little things to enjoy about this movie as well. The action, well yes, generic, is enjoyable and serviceable. And Frigga's death I thought was handled rather well. We don't necessarily care about Frigga as a character dying because we just haven't spent enough time with her, so her actual death wasn't very impactful. But the funeral scene was handled beautifully because you saw how her passing affected characters we did care about, like Odin, Thor, and Loki. That being said, the Thor and Jane romance is still pretty awful, and if Taika Waititi is in some alternate universe watching this, I would just implore you to please drop the romance arc if possible, unless you can figure out some ingenious way to make it work, because it's just not working. Many are quick to point to Darcy, her intern Ian, and Selvig, who are essentially there as comic relief, and they say that they're some of the worst parts of not only this movie, but the rest of the MCU. Do I agree with that? Not really, no. To be clear though, do I think their jokes and their characters are great? No, they're really not. The jokes aren't very clever, and yes, watching Erik Selvig run around England naked is not very enjoyable. But, like the rest of this movie, I feel like they're harmless. They're not necessarily offensive, they're just not written very cleverly. And in the end, that primarily sums up how I feel about this movie. It's harmless. Unlike the other MCU films, this one clocks in at less than 2 hours, so if you really hate it, well, at least there's not a lot of it. While this film doesn't have a lot of originality to offer up, it is mildly entertaining for the length of its runtime. Thor is much more likable as a character, and Loki is primarily the reason why I can make it through this film comfortably. While the Thor and Jane romance still doesn't work, it's not enough to completely sink this movie. The villain's bland, the action's bland, the story's bland, basically everything about this movie is bland. So I'll give Thor the Dark World a C and a 6.5 out of 10. I tried to think of a good sting to end this video, but this movie really is that unmemorable. So let's just enjoy this iconic Loki clip instead.
Well done. You just decapitated your grandfather.
Comment down below with your favorite Thor the Dark World moment. We're chugging along, and next up in the MCU is where it really starts to hit into another gear because we got the Winter Soldier up next. Make sure to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel. If you'd like to see some more of my videos, check out the videos on the screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.